Anthony Bradley had never been the kind of man to seek attention. At 62, with weathered hands and a quietly sharp gaze, he carried himself with the understated discipline of someone who'd worked the land and the ledgers alike. He had spent most of his adult life running a regional equipment distribution company, tractors, irrigation systems, storage tanks, and when he finally sold it 5 years ago, he did something rare in this world. He didn't expand, brag, or sink into restlessness. He downsized his life deliberately, bought a quiet 10-acre parcel just outside Cedar Hollow in Utah, and turned part of it into a soft, fruited microfarm that supplied local cafes and health food stores with seasonal berries. The rest of the land was left largely untouched: gentle slopes, irrigation trenches, and a few sheds for tools, barrels, and mulch. He never planned to turn it into a full-scale operation. It wasn't about that. It was about peace and utility, and the simple gratification of being left alone to do something honest. His plot wasn't technically residential, nor was it zoned for commercial expansion. It fell into a thin legal line of unincorporated agricultural buffer land. Land that was once dismissed as unusable but had in recent years become increasingly desirable as new developments crept closer and suburban sprawl pushed boundaries with a greedy inevitability. Anthony's neighbors, as it happened, were not farmers nor even particularly neighborly. Over the last 3 years, rows of identical clay-roofed homes had emerged just downhill from his property, cookie-cutter boxes stacked like a monopoly board, all part of a private residential initiative spearheaded by a self-appointed community board that oversaw everything from hedge height to which contractor was allowed to install gutters. It didn't affect Anthony directly, not at first. His property sat just outside their jurisdiction. No contracts, no agreements, no membership. He was a blip on their landscape, an outsider they couldn't quite pull into their web. That annoyed them. Particularly Karen Miller. Karen was not elected to anything official, but in her mind, she ran the entire development. Short-haired, smile-tight, and always on the verge of carrying a clipboard, Karen was the type of woman who introduced herself by asking if your driveway met compliance. Her husband, Justin, a nondescript man in khakis who always seemed to be carrying a drill or measuring tape, often lingered near Anthony's access road, claiming he was inspecting runoff patterns or assessing community boundaries. Anthony saw through it. He had watched people like this before in his former business, people who weaponized rules to fill voids in their own lives. They didn't want cooperation. They wanted control. The trouble began with trash bins. Anthony had long used a private waste contractor from a nearby town, Delman Disposal, a no-nonsense cash-on-delivery outfit that didn't require logins or loyalty points. They picked up his bins every other Tuesday without complaint and left handwritten receipts in his mailbox. That routine had worked flawlessly for 4 years, until one Tuesday he noticed his bins had vanished. Gone. Just like that. In their place were 2 larger branded containers belonging to EcoSure Sanitation, the company exclusively contracted by the neighboring community. Taped to one of the bins was a laminated tag reading, "Bin placement updated for compliance, Miller Neighborhood Association." No name. No explanation. At first, Anthony thought it was a mix-up. Perhaps one of the new residents had misplaced their bins. He walked them down to the edge of the paved cul-de-sac and left them near a lamppost. But 2 days later, they were back, this time placed squarely next to his main irrigation trench and already filled with someone else's trash. It wasn't just an inconvenience. He depended on that trench staying clear for seasonal watering. It wasn't just a few cans and bags, either. There was cardboard, plastic wrapping, and something that looked suspiciously like contractor debris. Anthony didn't call or yell. He drove into town, found the municipal zoning office, and requested a jurisdictional property map, just to confirm what he already knew. His land was still legally outside any residential authority. It had not been annexed, not rezoned, and no service agreements had been signed. He even pulled up his latest property tax statement to make sure. Everything aligned with what he remembered, but just to be thorough, he called EcoSure directly. After waiting on hold for nearly 20 minutes, he reached someone in onboarding coordination, who curtly told him that his address had been added to a group contract managed by a neighborhood committee. When he asked who authorized it, the line went quiet for a beat before the woman simply said, "You'll need to take that up with your local representative." He didn't have one. That same evening, as the sun slanted low across his field, Anthony saw Justin Miller crouched near the corner of his fence line. Not trespassing, technically, but close enough to pretend ignorance. Justin was holding a clipboard and gesturing to someone out of sight. Anthony stood at a distance, watching. He didn't wave, didn't move, just stared. The next morning, a thick envelope appeared in his mailbox. It was unmarked, but inside was a folded packet containing a Notice of Service Activation, an invoice for $3,980 labeled Quarterly Sanitation Assessment and Early Enforcement Review, and an unsigned letter stating that his continued resistance to integrated waste protocol would be interpreted as willful community sabotage. Anthony read the letter twice, set it down on his workbench, and let out a long breath. It wasn't the money. He could afford the invoice a dozen times over. It was the principle. He hadn't agreed to anything. He hadn't signed. He hadn't been consulted. And now, somehow, his land was being turned into someone else's chessboard, because a few suburban planners decided a buffer lot looked bad on a map. What disturbed him more was the language: early enforcement, integrated protocol. These were not terms used by average citizens. They were corporate terms, bureaucratic code for "you don't matter." He called his attorney the next day. Ethan Robards wasn't a real estate lawyer, not exclusively, but he had represented Anthony before in a business dissolution case, and Anthony trusted him. He didn't deal in theatrics, just facts. Ethan reviewed the documents, furrowed his brow, and said something that stuck in Anthony's mind. "This isn't about trash. They're probing for cracks. If they get you to concede here, they'll push the line again in 6 months. Utilities, drainage, access road, until they absorb you whole." That night, Anthony walked the perimeter of his land. The air was sharp and dry, and he could smell dust and pine resin on the wind. He paused near the north fence where his barrels used to be before they were carted off. Somewhere down the hill, lights flickered from Karen's porch. He could almost hear her smug voice telling someone over the phone, "We're just trying to bring order." Anthony tightened the latch on his gate and turned back toward his workshop. They thought this was just about garbage. They didn't realize they'd just dragged the wrong man into the game. 2 weeks had passed since the unsolicited trash bins arrived on Anthony Bradley's land, and what began as a bureaucratic irritation had begun to metastasize into something darker, something aggressive in its intent and deliberately obscure in its execution. The invoice for nearly $4,000, ridiculous on its face, had not been rescinded. In fact, just days after Anthony consulted his attorney, a second envelope arrived. This one marked "Final Warning Before Escalation." It included not only a duplicate of the previous invoice, but an additional fee of $185 for processing delay. Plus a note, this time with a name: Karen Miller, Community Oversight Liaison. The letter, on a heavy cream stock with a cheap embossed emblem, carried a tone that balanced somewhere between smug professionalism and passive threat. It stated that continued obstruction and failure to adhere to sanitary compliance timelines may result in administrative claims of hazard designation and forced mediation through municipal sanitation arbitration channels. Anthony stared at the sentence for a long moment, then handed the letter to Ethan over their usual late-morning coffee. Ethan read it, blinked once, and asked, What even is forced mediation through sanitation arbitration? That's not a thing. That's just a jumble of words that sound scary to people who don't know any better. But Anthony did know better, and that was the problem. He could see the tactic plainly. This wasn't about legality or logic. It was about grinding down resistance through repetition, noise, and fatigue. The goal wasn't to be right, it was to be relentless. Paper warfare, layered language, administrative attrition. The following day, Anthony found a bright orange sticker plastered across the gate to his access road. It read, "Sanitation access under review. Unauthorized dumping may result in escalated response." It was affixed directly to the steel, the adhesive aggressive enough that removing it left a visible scar in the paint. That same evening, he noticed a new vehicle idling just outside the easement that bordered his land. A white municipal-style pickup with no license plate visible and a small orange light on top. Inside, a man sat staring down at a clipboard, pretending not to notice Anthony standing 20 feet away with arms crossed. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The message was clear. You're being watched, and we're not going away. Anthony began documenting everything, not with the paranoia of a man who feared litigation, but with the quiet precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime managing operations, systems, and internal disputes. He took time-stamped photos of the sticker, of the truck, of every envelope that arrived and every bin that reappeared, now with increasing frequency and no apparent pattern. He stored each image in a digital log, sent daily copies to Ethan, and printed backups just in case. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was building a record, brick by brick, because he sensed what was coming. Then the bins came back again, this time 4 of them, lined neatly in a row just inside his fence line, blocking part of the trail he used to transport soil and tools to the south end of the property. They were already full when he found them, stuffed with yard debris, fast food wrappers, someone's broken patio umbrella, and, disturbingly, a pile of bundled newspapers soaked in what looked like motor oil. The smell alone was enough to make his stomach turn. On one of the bins, a handwritten tag was taped with electrical tape. Final placement. Verified for review. There was no signature, no contact number, just that one chilling phrase, verified for review, as though someone else now had the authority to audit his use of his own land. Anthony didn't touch the bins. He called Ethan, explained the situation, and asked a very simple question. Can they do this? Like, physically come onto my land and leave something here without my consent? Ethan's answer came slow and measured. Number? But if they claim it was an honest mistake, they'll say they thought the property line was unclear, or that it was left adjacent to yours and someone must have moved it. They'll muddy it just enough to avoid clear liability. But if they do it again, that's not a mistake. That's coordinated trespass. Trespass. The word stuck in Anthony's mind like a barb. 3 days later, he received a certified envelope bearing a wax seal. Yes, an actual wax seal, as if someone had confused modern civil code with medieval land decrees. Inside, beneath a deliberately excessive heading reading, "Notice of Hazard Assessment Pending," was a multi-page report prepared by a company called Norwell Environmental Consulting. The report contained no photographs, no verified signatures, but plenty of charts, strange notations, and recommendations to reclassify Anthony's property as Transitional Industrial Abandoned Activity Zone, based on unregistered waste presence and questionable container histories. He read the phrase twice. Questionable container histories? It was a joke, a corporate hallucination dressed in bureaucratic formality. But jokes didn't come with consequences like this. At the bottom of the packet, in small italic print, was a paragraph that made Anthony's pulse jump. Upon completion of the classification process, Properties found in material violation of sanitation and environmental protocol may be reviewed for emergency acquisition and redevelopment under Section 18B of the Community Act. Private Ordinance. Extension. It wasn't a bluff. It was a legal foothold. They were trying to lay the groundwork to claim his land through some obscure, likely unenforceable policy buried in layers of private agreements and third-party paperwork. He drove into town the next day and walked directly into the county office of land records. After waiting 20 minutes behind a pair of newlyweds registering a homestead exemption, he was called to the counter by a tired-looking clerk named Melissa, who took his parcel number and typed it into her terminal. Her face twisted slightly as she read the screen. "There's a temporary review hold on this property," she said. "Looks like it was flagged last week for jurisdictional reevaluation under regional compliance initiatives." Anthony's eyes narrowed. "Flagged by who?" "I'm not sure," Melissa replied. "That part isn't showing up here. Could be from the private side. Contracted review group. They push those sometimes to trigger a compliance map update." He thanked her, walked out to his truck, sat in silence for a full minute, and finally exhaled slowly through his nose. It was all coordinated. Not spontaneous. Not accidental. They were pushing pressure points. They wanted him either to yield or to lash out. Either would give them ammunition. So he didn't yield, and he didn't lash out. He opened his laptop that night and logged into a site most people in his town had never heard of. An auction clearinghouse for commercial contracts and distressed businesses. There, amid listings for shuttered laundromats and defunct HVAC repair firms, he found something very interesting. A sanitation logistics group based 2 towns over was quietly listing partial interest in a regional hauling firm that subcontracted for several of the larger disposal companies, including EcoSure. Anthony didn't click buy right then. He wasn't reckless. But he flagged the listing, ran a basic corporate chain of ownership trace, and noted one curious connection. The firm had recently changed its name from Red Basin Transit Solutions to Novatech Environmental Services, a rebrand done, apparently, to avoid scrutiny tied to compliance violations dating back 2 years. The wheels began to turn. This wasn't about trash anymore. It hadn't been for weeks. This was about territory, leverage, and soft conquest through paperwork. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Anthony Bradley didn't fight on the surface. He fought from underneath, quietly, thoroughly, and once he started, he never stopped. The shift from pressure to provocation was subtle at first, but by the 3rd week of sustained harassment, Anthony Bradley recognized the turn instinctively. He had seen it before, not on his land, but in boardrooms and distribution contracts, in how certain people applied leverage when they couldn't get outright consent. The change came not through escalation in language, but in the erosion of boundaries. What had begun as ridiculous threats and corporate gibberish transformed into physical interference with his daily operation. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It was deliberate sabotage. It started with the gravel road that ran from Anthony's front gate to the lower tract, where he kept a loading dock and half a dozen water tanks he used during berry season. One Monday morning, after a night of heavy wind, Anthony found 3 of the EcoSure bins had been pushed directly into the path of his delivery truck. But this time, the bins were chained together with a combination lock. Looped around a steel post someone had jammed into the ground like a survey marker. The lock was new. The post hadn't been there the day before. On the ground beside them, in fluorescent chalk, someone had scrawled, "Zonal Access Point. Review Hold." It was theatrical. It was aggressive. And it had been done overnight. Anthony didn't speak. He didn't take pictures. He went to his shed, brought out his bolt cutters, and with one steady motion, severed the chain. He didn't throw the bins. He didn't curse. He simply rolled them aside and called his contractor to postpone the delivery. It was a minor inconvenience on paper, but to Anthony, the message was loud and clear. They weren't just building a case, they were baiting him into a mistake. He called Ethan, who immediately picked up on the shift in tactics. "They're testing response thresholds now," he said, "trying to document whether you're being hostile or uncooperative. If they can turn this into a behavioral issue, they'll escalate it from compliance to safety. And if it's a safety matter, they'll have legal pretext to file an injunction or restrict access." "Then we don't give them that," Anthony replied. No theatrics. No phone calls, just counteraction. Ethan paused for a moment, then said, "You sure about this?" "I'm sure," Anthony said. "We play by the rules, but we write our own set." By the end of that week, Anthony hired a licensed surveyor, someone unaffiliated with the county, to recertify the boundaries of his land. The process cost nearly $4,000 and took 3 days of measurements. But when it was done, he had a notarized GPS-mapped survey in hand that clearly marked his lines. Every bin placement, every obstruction, every illegal intrusion now had a legally defined coordinate attached to it. It was a shield, not from further harassment, but from legal misrepresentation. If they wanted to argue property line confusion, he could now throw official documentation in their face. It wouldn't stop them, but it would slow them down. Then came the letter from the Department of the Public Waste. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't stamped. It came in a white envelope, digitally printed, marked as automatic correspondence. The letter stated that Anthony's address had been flagged for reassignment under Unified Waste Logistics Consolidation, a phrase so carefully sterile it was almost meaningless. But beneath it was the detail that made his blood run cold. As part of the transitional review process, your property may be subjected to temporary conditional service reassignment until further municipal clarification. It was jargon, sure, but it was also code for something simple. They were now pretending he'd opted into their system, and unless he proved otherwise, they could act as if he belonged to them. He drove to the department office the next morning, in person, where a tired man at the window looked up his address and frowned. "There's a crossover here," the man said. "Looks like your parcel ID is showing in both agricultural exemption and mixed-use transition zone. That shouldn't be possible unless someone submitted a boundary conversion." "I didn't submit anything," Anthony said. His voice was calm but tight. "Well, someone did," the clerk replied, flipping the screen around. There, in grainy black and white, was a scanned form labeled Service Expansion Authorization. It bore a name he recognized immediately, Justin Miller. "I want a copy of that," Anthony said. He took it straight to Ethan, who examined the document and muttered, "This is not even remotely valid. There's no signature from the landowner, no parcel authorization. This was submitted with a proxy ID tag. They used a commercial overlay to fake jurisdiction." He looked up at Anthony. "They didn't just make a mistake. They forged expansion rights using a contractor login. That's a felony." Anthony didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just said, "Then let's hit back." But even as Ethan drafted the complaint to the state zoning board, Anthony focused on the second front. Quietly, methodically, with the same discipline that had made his old business succeed. The sanitation subcontract listing he'd flagged weeks earlier was still available. The investment holding group that owned partial interest in the waste network had begun offering additional shares due to strategic restructuring, which Anthony knew was coded language for bleeding capital. He reached out to a private intermediary, using one of his dormant LLCs from the equipment business days, and began acquisition proceedings. It wasn't fast. It wasn't flashy. But by the end of the week, he controlled 51% of the voting stock in a shell firm that owned 39% of the regional hauling operation behind EcoSure's infrastructure. That was the moment everything shifted. Anthony now had a quiet say in route design, pricing strategy, contract bid proposals, and, most critically, service area determination. He didn't exercise it immediately. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he observed the inner workings. The contracts tied to residential developments, the bonuses triggered by compliance expansions, the backdoor coordination between certain community committees and hauling operators. It wasn't illegal. Not exactly. But it was dirty. They were inflating waste metrics to justify service growth, then pushing costs back onto landowners like Anthony through fake regional consolidations. He called in a meeting, not public, not aggressive, just a quiet internal adjustment. Rates in districts with flagged disputes like the Miller Tract would now be subject to evaluation-based risk indexing. That was a nice way of saying, you want to play hardball? You're going to pay for the gloves. Within 10 days, every house in Karen Miller's community received a new invoice. Prices for waste pickup had tripled. Overflow fees were added. Administrative processing charges were layered on top. And because the contracts were ironclad and pre-approved by their own board, they couldn't get out of it without incurring termination penalties that made staying cheaper than leaving. It was legal. It was strategic. And it sent a message. Karen knocked on Anthony's gate that weekend. She didn't shout. She didn't bring a camera. She simply stood there with her arms crossed, staring at the man who had become the immovable object in her well-curated neighborhood. Anthony walked out slowly, closed the gap between them, and waited. "You think this is funny?" she asked. Her voice was cold, brittle. Anthony didn't respond. "You've made a lot of people angry," she said. "People who don't forget." "Good," he replied. "Maybe they'll remember where the line is next time." He didn't slam the gate. He didn't threaten her. He simply walked back to his workshop, where a fresh delivery of aluminum piping waited to be installed along the trench line. There was work to do. He was behind schedule. He didn't have time for vendettas. But if they wanted a war, he was now on the board, and he'd just made the first real move. If there was a single moment where Anthony Bradley understood that this had evolved beyond a land dispute or even a tactical retaliation, it came one gray Tuesday morning when he opened his mailbox to find a notice from the county tax assessor's office. The envelope was plain, the lettering bureaucratic, but the content hit like a hammer. A scheduled inspection had been ordered to reassess the taxable classification of his property. The reason cited was ambiguous. Potential transition from agricultural to mixed-use utility designation. A term vague enough to trigger further inquiry but specific enough to sound like the consequence of actual procedure. It was, to Anthony, the clearest signal yet that someone had started pulling higher levers. Someone who knew how to move paper through the right channels and make it look like the natural grind of policy. He sat on his porch with the letter in his hand, reading it again and again, looking for any phrase or code that would suggest it was simply another bluff. But it wasn't. This was state level. That made it real and dangerous. Tax reclassification wasn't like a trash bill. It didn't come with notices and phone calls. It came with reassessments, increased levies, and, if challenged incorrectly, legal fees that would bleed even a stable man dry over time. He phoned Ithon immediately. The call was short and serious. "They're escalating," Ithon said, "and it's not the committee anymore. It's someone feeding data upstream. The only way the assessor's office gets involved this quickly is if a formal complaint came through channels they recognize. Environmental reports, contractor declarations, things that are tied to credentialed sources. Then it's someone on the inside," Anthony said. "Maybe," Ethan replied. "Or it's someone with access to a network of them." That night, Anthony returned to his surveyor's documents and cross-checked his boundary report with the county zoning maps available through the public access portal. It took over an hour, but the pattern became visible. 3 properties adjacent to his southern fence line had recently filed drainage improvement forms, on paper, routine, but all of them referenced shared infrastructure runoff pathways, a term that only made sense if Anthony's land was considered part of a greater municipal system. It wasn't, but someone was trying to make it look that way on record. In short, they were pretending he was already part of the grid. And that's when he made the decision to stop playing defense. Up until that point, Anthony had reacted, smartly, patiently, even ruthlessly at times, but still in response to what was thrown at him. But this was the point where he understood he had to push forward, not merely resist. That night, he reached out to Darren York, an independent infrastructure analyst and old acquaintance from his distribution days, someone with experience tracing utility funding streams and regional development rollouts. They hadn't spoken in years, but after a brief conversation and a wiring of consulting fees, Darren agreed to dig. Within 4 days, Darren sent back a 15-page report outlining a pattern Anthony suspected but hadn't been able to prove. Over the past 9 months, a private development group called Twin Pines Consolidated had been lobbying quietly to install a regional transfer station for waste and recyclable materials just east of Cedar Hollow. The site, however, required certain logistical qualifiers, specifically a corridor of properties zoned as mixed-use or utility adjacent in order to qualify for state-matching funds. The catch? The current area didn't meet those qualifiers, unless, of course, a small sliver of land, like Anthony's, were transitioned through environmental or regulatory redirection. It would open the entire grid to public utility designation. Anthony's land wasn't just in their way. It was their missing puzzle piece. And they hadn't approached him with an offer. They had tried to corner him with policy. Now it all made sense. The forged service expansions, the trash bins, the boundary confusions, even the inspection notices. They weren't trying to win a zoning case. They were trying to fabricate a grid. Anthony shared the report with Ethan and waited. The reply was swift. "We use this, but not in court. Not yet. First, they'd leak it, quietly, not to the media, but to specific regulatory watch groups that loathed backdoor development deals. Ethan had connections in environmental compliance circles, people who didn't like being made fools of. Meanwhile, Anthony took his own step. As majority shareholder in the waste subcontractor company, he initiated a reorganization motion, a quiet one under the guise of quarterly realignment. Under this motion, he authorized a legal audit of every contract between EcoSure and its residential clients. His goal wasn't exposure, it was leverage. If even one of the Miller contracts was found to have misrepresented jurisdiction, such as claiming enforcement over land outside their authority, it would void the service zone map and trigger massive breach penalties. That would hurt the committee, badly. Karen, naturally, came knocking again. This time, she didn't even try to be civil. She marched up to the gate, waving a piece of paper. "You're having our waste records pulled?" she snapped. Anthony looked at her calmly. "Public service audits are routine, nothing personal." "Don't play cute," she said. "You're manipulating this." "You started it," he said flatly. "I'm just playing by your rules." Her face reddened. "You think you've won. This is bigger than you. You don't understand what you're interfering with." "Try me," he replied. She stormed off, and Anthony knew 2 things with certainty. She hadn't known about the Twin Pines deal until very recently, and now that she did, she was afraid she was being cut out of something she thought she'd helped build. Good. Let them eat each other from the inside. As the inspection date loomed, Anthony did what he always did in times of pressure. He worked. He laid new pipework in the back plot. He resurfaced the trench. He replaced the mulch layer on the west row. His land, unlike theirs, didn't depend on approval. It grew what it grew, because he made it grow. Let them come. He wasn't just ready. He was miles ahead. By the time the county assessor's inspector finally arrived, Anthony Bradley had already prepared every inch of his land with the precision of a man who had fought too many quiet wars to leave a single corner exposed. The irrigation lines were flush. The debris areas were cleared. The bins he now legally controlled through a proxy entity were nowhere in sight. His records were printed, laminated, and bound by parcel grid. Even the workshop, which had previously been cluttered with soil bags and aluminum tubing, had been swept and arranged with almost surgical tidiness. Anthony wasn't aiming to impress. He was aiming to leave nothing, absolutely nothing, for them to exploit. The inspector, a polite man in his early 40s named Nolan Trent, arrived on a cool morning just before 9 a.m. He was dressed not in a suit or an official uniform, but in practical field gear, cargo pants, a collared shirt with an embroidered county logo, and a scanning tablet clipped to his belt. He introduced himself with a clipped handshake and a neutral tone. Anthony offered black coffee, which the man declined, and for a moment there was a pause, as if both men were measuring each other not for combat, but for signs of intent. They walked the land together. Anthony kept his voice even, answering each question with exactness. Parcel designation? Agricultural? Verified? Utility use? None beyond localized irrigation. Refused storage? None on site. Registered contract with external services? Present, documented, and not affiliated with any regional sanitation consolidation. Trent scanned, logged, and nodded without offering much opinion. But it was the questions he didn't ask, the absences, that told Anthony everything. This wasn't a routine assessment. This was a targeted pass, initiated by someone upstairs, not because Anthony had triggered concern, but because someone needed him cleared or flagged. They concluded the walk, and before departing, Nolan said, almost in passing, "Expect follow-up. I've been told this isn't the only review in this zone." Anthony said nothing. He didn't need to. By that afternoon, word had spread. 3 neighboring properties had also been visited, 2 of which shared fencing with Anthony, and 1 of which belonged to a man named Ray Tomlinson, a former agriculture professor who had once tried to sell his land to a developer and backed out at the last minute. Ray stopped by Anthony's gate that evening, holding a beer and looking slightly winded. "They hit me with a parcel reclassification review," Ray said without preamble. "Same as you, I'm guessing." Anthony nodded. "I never signed anything," Ray added, his tone frustrated. "They're saying I'm within a projected runoff zone for a future collection facility. I told them runoff from what exactly? They wouldn't say." Anthony stared toward the fence line and replied, "They're priming the corridor." "You're in the way." Ray took a swig of his beer and asked, "So, what now?" Anthony didn't answer, but he was already forming the next step. The following week saw a sharp increase in administrative noise. He received a series of corrective notices from various channels, some citing minor infractions, misaligned property markers, outdated zoning registry codes, unclear easement designations. They were small individually, but stacked together, they created a paper trail meant to justify future intervention. At the same time, the Waste Collection Division under Anthony's partial ownership began receiving anonymous complaints about service disruptions, billing irregularities, and, most notably, retaliatory pricing strategies. It was transparent, and it was tactical. But now, Anthony was ready to swing the hammer. He initiated a full forensic audit of the Miller area service contracts through his corporate authority. The audit, conducted by a third-party compliance firm, uncovered multiple irregularities. Dozens of service authorizations had been backdated. Signatures were identical across unrelated properties. Worse, certain adjustments had been made using inactive user credentials, including one belonging to a contractor who had been deceased for over a year. It wasn't just sloppiness. It was institutional fraud. Anthony turned the audit into leverage, forwarding copies to the Municipal Waste Board and, separately, to the internal ethics review body tied to regional service oversight. He didn't need to accuse anyone. The documents spoke for themselves. What followed was swift and violent in the corporate sense. The EcoSure director for the Cedar Hollow zone was placed on leave. A board-level inquiry was initiated. Several community contracts, including those signed by Karen's committee, were frozen pending a procedural review. And then the blowback began. Karen called a special meeting for her committee, but this time, the tone had changed. Instead of dictating action, she was begging for solidarity. Some residents were no longer supporting her. The triple rate hikes, the sudden inspections, the revelations about backdated signatures, none of them played well in a neighborhood where most people had moved in to avoid exactly this kind of drama. She tried to blame Anthony, but the community no longer saw him as the aggressor. He hadn't spoken in public, hadn't posted any statements, hadn't retaliated visibly, and somehow that silence had worked in his favor. Karen knocked on his gate again that weekend. Her tone was different, not angry, almost brittle. "You know what you're doing," she said. "You know how this ends." Anthony studied her. She looked tired. Her blazer was rumpled. Her voice cracked in the middle of her sentence. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "We were just trying to improve things. The waste contract was supposed to help everyone. We didn't know it was fraudulent." Anthony didn't gloat. He didn't push. "I just want to be left alone," he said. Karen exhaled slowly, then nodded once. "You're not the only one." And with that, she left. But the storm wasn't over. It simply shifted. Over the next month, Anthony's land became the target of subtler harassment. Delivery trucks that never arrived. Utilities momentarily disconnected, in error. Anonymous tips to environmental boards alleging pesticide runoff and unauthorized construction. All of it unfounded, but all of it draining time, energy, and patience. He handled it like he always did, with documentation, with measured replies, and with absolute discipline. But the pressure mounted. And then came the real test, a legal summons. Filed not by Karen, not by the waste companies, but by Twin Pines Consolidated itself. They were suing him for obstruction of critical infrastructure development. Their claim? That Anthony's misuse of the waste system and his coordinated price restructuring had damaged their regional development project and harmed the public interest. It was an absurd claim, but it was public and expensive. Ithan read the filing and immediately knew the play. "They don't care about winning," he said. "They want to entangle you, delay you, drain you." But Anthony was done playing inside their framework. He responded with a countersuit, not for damages, but for discovery. His attorneys requested all communications between Twin Pines and the Miller Committee, all planning records tied to the proposed corridor, and all emails referencing Parcel 147B, his land. And that was when the cracks appeared. Twin Pines didn't fight the countersuit. They stalled. They shifted venues. They filed for injunctions. But they didn't submit the documents, because they knew what was in them. And Anthony knew they knew. The moment the court ordered them to comply, they filed to settle. It wasn't loud, it wasn't publicized, but it was complete. They agreed to withdraw all future claims on his parcel. They paid his legal fees. They even issued a statement of non-affiliation with the Miller Committee. It was, by every measure, a quiet defeat. And in its wake, the neighborhood changed. Karen stepped down from her role. Several of her allies moved. The EcoSure contracts were renegotiated under new terms. Terms Anthony helped write, through the board seat he now quietly controlled. And his land? It stayed exactly as it was. Quiet, productive, and entirely his. No bins, no signs, no trespass. Just rows of blueberries ripening in the sun. The legal battle may have ended on paper, but Anthony Bradley knew that true closure rarely came with a signed settlement or court-issued statement. He didn't celebrate. He didn't speak publicly. He simply got back to work. The harvest season was approaching, and the first bloom of summer had already begun to tint his berry rows in deep hues of purple and blue. But something had changed in the soil, not just beneath his feet, but in the way people looked at his land, and at him. The neighborhood that once eyed him like an intruder now spoke of him in quiet tones, some with resentment, others with unexpected respect. But Anthony wasn't interested in vindication. What he wanted was permanence, not just to win, but to ensure no one could ever try this again. He spent the next several weeks closing the loop. Using his newfound influence within the waste management structure, Anthony spearheaded the implementation of a new internal review system, one that required physical site verification and photographic evidence before any pricing changes or service expansions could be processed. The system, rolled out across several zones, effectively killed the strategy that had been used against him. It also brought quiet fury from those who had once benefited from the loopholes. A few board members resigned. A few whispered threats made their way back to Anthony through back channels. But no one made a direct move, until someone did. One morning, Anthony walked to the southeast corner of his property and found a stretch of his irrigation line deliberately cut. Not a break from wear, not animal damage. It had been sliced with precision, and judging by the footprints nearby, boot prints that didn't belong to him, it had happened during the night. He followed the trail to the fence and saw where the wire had been twisted back and resealed with a plastic fastener. Whoever did it knew how to leave a wound that would take time to detect, but not long enough to kill a crop. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a message. He didn't report it. There was no point. The sheriff's department had been cooperative throughout the property battle, but even they were tired of the tension, and there were no cameras in that corner. Anthony knew he had to respond, but not emotionally, not reactively. He walked the entire property twice, checking the rest of the lines, scanning the trenches, even examining the storage tanks. No other sabotage, just one precise incision, a warning shot. 2 days later, he received a private email through the anonymous feedback channel set up by the waste company's board. It was short. "You're disrupting more than garbage contracts. You should step back." It wasn't signed. The address was fake, but it came through a secure channel, which meant someone inside the system had used company credentials to send it. That narrowed the pool of suspects. Anthony traced the login history with the help of an IT consultant he trusted, and the trail led to a device used in the regional office downtown, the same office where many of the EcoSure transition plans had first originated. He passed the findings to the Internal Ethics Review Committee. A week later, one mid-level manager was dismissed quietly. No charges, no headlines, just a silent exit. But Anthony knew this wasn't over. It was quieter now, more insidious. The attacks wouldn't be public anymore. They'd be silent, precise, designed to erode rather than destroy. He adjusted accordingly, reinforced his irrigation system with pressure sensors, installed motion-activated spotlights in the blind zones, moved his business records and land documents to a secure third-party vault, and he stopped using digital payment platforms entirely for local operations. Every transaction now occurred by check or by hand. He didn't talk about it. He just did it. And then came the proposal. An official envelope arrived one afternoon, bearing the seal of the state's Department of Infrastructure Development. Inside was a formal request. Would Anthony consider a public-private partnership to turn the far west end of his property into a community resource hub? They offered generous tax offsets, infrastructure funding, and long-term revenue participation. The wording was soft, almost flattering. A shared vision, they called it. An opportunity to align local growth with sustainable stewardship. Anthony read the proposal 3 times and then laughed. It wasn't humorless, but it was cold. He didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, he reviewed every transaction that had ever touched that parcel line, and in doing so, he found something. A shadow filing from 2 years prior, an environmental impact placeholder submitted by a now-defunct shell company tied to Twin Pines. It had been quietly withdrawn after their failed acquisition attempt, but it left a trail that suggested this partnership was nothing more than a repackaged attempt to annex his land through goodwill. He took the document to Ethan, who read it slowly and then said, "They don't know you still have this." Anthony shook his head. "They assume I deleted it. I didn't." "You going to publish it?" "No," Anthony said. "I'm going to use it." He scheduled a private meeting with the regional director of the infrastructure office. No lawyers, no press, just one-on-one. During the meeting, Anthony laid the document on the table, said nothing for a long moment, then finally spoke. "I know who submitted this. I know when. I know why. If you ever submit anything tied to my parcel again, I'll have this notarized and handed to 3 different land advocacy groups within 24 hours. The director didn't argue. He nodded slowly and took the paper back. The message had landed. That night, Anthony sat alone on the porch of his workshop, watching the wind move through the rows. The silence was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was earned, the kind of stillness that only came after enduring siege without surrender. He hadn't destroyed anyone. He hadn't gone to war in the traditional sense, but he had done something much rarer. He had outlasted an entire system designed to grind people down and force compliance through pressure, fatigue, and manipulation. His land was his. His operation was intact. His name was known, but not spoken. There would be no more mailings, no more trash bins, no more surprise inspectors, and even if they tried again, they'd find a man not just prepared, but already 10 steps ahead. He walked back inside, placed the last printed copy of the settlement in his locked drawer, and turned off the light. There was still work to do, always would be. But now it was on his terms, and no one else's. By the time autumn settled in over Cedar Hollow, the air had changed, not just in temperature, but in temperament. The days grew shorter, the leaves crisped into amber and rust, and the silence that once felt oppressive now carried a different weight, something deeper and more final. On Anthony Bradley's land, the harvest had been good. Not record-breaking, not extraordinary, but consistent, predictable, the kind of result that came not from good fortune, but from a structure held steady through pressure, and from a man who refused to move just because it was easier than standing still. The residents of the surrounding neighborhood still lived their lives, cut their lawns, drove their children to school, waved to each other with cautious smiles, but there was a noticeable shift in how they treated the man at the edge of their subdivision. They no longer complained about the smell of mulch after rain. They didn't question the low rumble of his generator during irrigation cycles. They didn't ask where the bins had gone, or why their rates had dropped after a sudden and unannounced policy restructuring in their waste contract. They knew. Everyone knew. But nobody said it aloud. Karen Miller had listed her home 6 weeks after the settlement. It didn't sell immediately. Rumors about her involvement in the forged documents and the subsequent price hikes had traveled further than she anticipated. At an open house, a prospective buyer recognized her name from a local watchdog blog and left before seeing the second floor. 2 months later, the "For Sale" sign was removed, and the lights in her front windows stayed off most nights. Her husband was never seen again in Anthony's line of sight. Not that Anthony had expected an apology. People like them didn't apologize, they recalibrated. Anthony had no interest in vengeance. He didn't speak to reporters. He declined invitations from local landowners associations who wanted him to share his story. There were no Facebook posts, no podcasts, no memorialized threads about justice. He wasn't a symbol. He was a man who protected what was his. And when it was done, he went back to work. He built a new tool shed on the eastern slope, smaller than the original, but better insulated. He cleared out a thicket of blackberries that had overgrown along the fence and replaced it with a row of black locust trees, fast-growing and dense. Good windbreakers. Good privacy. He reseeded the west plot, laid gravel along the south path, and added solar lights that lit only his side of the fence. Everything intentional. Everything within his line. There would be no next time. But if there was, he'd see it coming. Occasionally, people would stop by, quiet, unannounced. One was Ray Tomlinson, who brought a jar of homemade apple butter and said nothing about infrastructure. Another was a young man from the county office who'd reviewed one of the zoning complaints and later admitted, without detail, that things had gone too far. Anthony nodded, but said little. He didn't hold grudges, but he didn't forget. One afternoon, while cleaning debris near the South Trench, Anthony saw a boy from the neighborhood, 10, maybe 11, riding a bike along the edge of the fence. The boy stopped and stared through the posts for a long time, then called out, "You're the guy who grows the real food, right?" Anthony looked up and smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting in a rare gesture. "Something like that," he said. The boy nodded and rode off. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't legacy. But it was something. Weeks later, at a nearby town meeting, a proposal surfaced to expand the regional waste infrastructure corridor again. Different wording, different map, but the same ultimate goal. It died on the floor without a vote. Anthony wasn't present. He didn't need to be. His name wasn't mentioned, but everyone in the room understood why no one wanted to touch the map again. That winter, the first frost hit late. Anthony took it as a sign that he could get one more round from the greenhouse. He worked late into the night, moving flats, checking humidity levels, prepping heating mats. There were no more surprises in the mail. No knocks on the gate. No trucks idling just beyond view. Just rows of plants, plastic trays, condensation on glass. No one could manufacture peace. You had to earn it and hold it. And Anthony Bradley had done both.